Hey, I'm Cam with Blacktail Studio, and this is a comprehensive video guide to getting a perfect finish on your wood table, even in a dusty shop. In this video, I'm going to take you through every step, starting at the sanding stage, all the way through the finishing, and finally the nano finish protectant to make sure that this beautiful table stays beautiful forever. The wood that I'm going to be demonstrating on is this beautiful 47-inch by 47-inch Bastogne walnut slab. This one is for a customer across the country, so I have to make sure that it doesn't just look beautiful when it leaves my shop, but stays beautiful for years to come because he's got kids, he's got a family. He's going to use this in the real world, and I can't come over and refinish it every 6 months or a couple of years. So I'm going to finish this so it is going to be essentially bulletproof for years to come. This finish process I'm going to show you will work on any wood table. It doesn't have to be Bastogne walnut. It could be white oak. It could be elm. It could be some reclaimed pallets that you've planed down and glued into a table. Any wood table can be finished with this technique and be guaranteed to last. The starting point for this particular table is essentially a pretty smooth top. All of the holes, all of the cracks, everything has been either filled with a resin or a CA glue and then sanded to 100 grit. The first thing I want to talk about is actually not directly related to the finish process, but I do think it's important to do it in this order, which is why I'm showing you here. And after I get to 100 grit, I like to round over my corners using this 1/8" router bit. And you can use any profile you want. I really like this 1/8" round over bit. And the reason I do it right after 100 grit is, one, we have a nice, essentially perfectly smooth surface. So if you do this before you get up to 100 grit, it tends to be a little bit rough. And two is when we run this over, we tend to kind of scuff up the wood a little bit. It'll leave a little bit of streaks in the wood. It kind of dents the side just ever so slightly. And we want to be able to remove that on the consecutive sanding passes when we move up through our sanding grits. So after we get to this 100 grit or even 120 grit, I'll run this 1/8" round over all the way around the perimeter as well as the corners. And I like to set my depth just a little bit low, so that way as we sand down, we maintain the perfect radius of that 1/8" router bit. And we'll show you some visuals to help that make sense here in just a couple minutes. All right, now that we got our corners rounded over, we need to smooth them over by hand. And this is the one part of the process that you really don't need any tool for. So all we really need is a sheet of sandpaper. And if you want to get really fancy, I made myself a DIY sanding glove with some Velcro and this old gardening glove. And I'll leave a link to the video where I made that in the description. But generally, you just take a piece of sandpaper. I like to go about 1 grit higher than I'm sanding. So I'm going to start at 120 grit. And I'm just going to smooth over the kind of chattery marks that router left. The general rule is when you're hand sanding, you need to sand with the grain, and the same doesn't go for when you're using an orbital sander, which we'll talk about later. But you can see here the grain is running this way, so I'm going to do my best to sand with the grain instead of running this way. I'll try to keep it mostly this way, and it's not the end of the world if you go a little bit against the grain, but as a whole, try to keep it with the grain. All right, we got our edges rounded over, we got them hand sanded, and we're ready to start with the serious sanding of the top and the sides. And before we do that, I want to talk about the equipment we're going to use. And just know, nothing in this video is sponsored. Everything is just my genuine opinion. And first thing I want to talk about is the sander. And I wish more than anything I could tell you that just go down to Harbor Freight or Home Depot and buy that $40 sander, and if you're talented, you can do just as good a job. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and I genuinely believe the first high-end woodworking tool you should buy is a high-end sander. I like this one from Festool. It's the ETS EC150. It's phenomenal. It barely vibrates in your hand. It's like a sports car. It's like turning the ignition on a Ferrari versus an old Ford Pinto. That said, it's like $500, almost $600, so it's not going to be for everybody. But if you're serious about woodworking, and if you're watching this video, I bet you are, it's something to really, really consider. That said, work with what you have, and if you can't afford the sander, you should at least buy the best sandpaper. And the good news about the sandpaper, it's not the most expensive either. This is the 3M Cubitron 2, and it is far and away the best sandpaper I've ever used. It has this crazy little honeycomb mesh pattern mixed with like a ceramic grit, and there's lots of videos on the science of it, but just know it removes more material faster in a finer finish than any other sandpaper I've ever used. All of that said, you don't have to use this sandpaper or this sander. I do recommend them, and I recommend them strongly, but we are going to start with 120 grit, make a pass across the entire top before moving on to the next step. You can see here why we like to use the router at that previous stage. There's a couple of pretty aggressive streaks, and they're going to sand out really easily, but if we did that at the very end, we might not be able to remove that with our finest sanding grit. So with this 120 grit, all of those router marks are going to be removed really quickly and easily. It's a little hard to show on camera, but here is why I like to set that router depth just a little bit too low. Because as we go through our sanding progressions, this little shoulder that I've left there, I can just barely catch with my fingernail, is going to slowly get removed, and by the time we get finished with our grits, we'll have that perfect 1/8 inch radius, whereas if I would have set that router depth at the perfect height before I did any sanding, as we go through our sanding progressions, we would shorten that radius and it wouldn't look quite as perfect. Anytime you're sanding a table, especially a large table like this one, it's pretty easy to lose track of what you sanded and what you haven't sanded. And this is an old woodworker's tip. I certainly didn't invent it. And it's just to take a pencil, and you don't want to push down so hard that you're going to dent the wood, but you just lightly scribble all over your wood. And this is going to make it really easy to track where you've sanded and where you haven't, because those pencil marks are going to be removed as soon as you have removed enough wood with your sander. So I'm going to hit the entire surface as well as the sides. Don't forget the sides. Now for the actual sanding progress itself, there's a lot of misinformation out there on how to use an orbital sander. You'll still hear people talking about you can only sand with the grain. That doesn't make any sense because the orbital sander spins the entire time it operates. So as you're working across your piece, that orbital sander is spinning and hitting the grain from every possible direction. So even if you're sanding with the grain, it's still spinning and hitting it from across the grain as well as with the grain. So what I like to do is I will maybe make a pass with the grain. I might make my next pass across the grain. I might make my next pass diagonal. The important thing is to hit the entire surface and also keep it slightly random. Don't make every pass with the grain, because what you'll get then is tracks in your sanding that will show up in your finishing. So don't go like your grandfather says and only sand with the grain. Mix it up and stagger it, especially between grits. If you do one pass with the grain, maybe next grit, go across the grain, or just keep it random. There are a few really important techniques to using an orbital sander. First and foremost, if you don't listen to anything else I say, listen to this. Always keep it flat. There's never a time that you should be angling it in. I know there's certain times when you think, oh, I just want to sand this one low spot. Your table should be flat. If you have a low spot in your table, it shouldn't be there. So the sander should always remain dead flat. Second is the speed. I used to move it probably a little bit too fast, and I've found myself now really just using about the weight of the sander, maybe just plus a couple pounds with my hand, and I'm letting the sander do the work. I'm not pushing too hard, and I'm moving at about 1 inch per second, which is the pretty standard rate that you hear people recommend. So I'm letting the sander do the work, not pushing down too hard, and this will take a long. Sanding this entire top will probably take me about 15 or 20 minutes per grit. As I'm working through this 120 grit sandpaper, I'm looking down and I find myself kind of creeping down, and I'm using these great photography lights that I have in my shop, and I remembered you guys might not have these same photography lights, which is a really important rule. You want some bright light. It doesn't have to be a fancy photography light though. It can be any old shop light you have. It's a good idea. Set it across from you at a slight angle so That way when you get down, you get the glare of that light, and that's going to really show any scratches or imperfections or these pencil marks and make it so you don't miss any spots. So really important rule, get that light on your table. It's going to make a huge difference. Another question I get all the time is what speed do I use on my sander? And I have experimented with a lot of different speeds with this particular sander, and I find myself almost always going back up to full speed. I find when I really slow it down, it can tend to kind of jump or chatter on me ever so slightly. So I keep it at full speed, and the vacuum, I also leave it pretty much turned up all the way. I know that Festool recommends turning the vacuum down. The idea being is it's going to create too much suction and it's going to pull too hard on your sander. I've experimented both ways and I have never found that to be the case with me personally, but Festool is pretty good at sanding, so you might want to listen to them, but for me, I haven't found that it makes a difference. Alright, I've just finished sanding this top with 120 grit, and now I'm going to water pop it. I tend to do the water pop between each grit, although I don't know that it's entirely necessary. You do want to do it at least once though, and all that water popping is, we're going to spritz some water on it and let it air dry. So for that, I keep my handy bottle of water, and then I'm just going to, you don't want to soak it, but just spray it down lightly. And this is going to raise the grain, ensuring that when we put our finish on, it doesn't raise the grain itself. You do want to make sure to get those corners, especially the ones you rounded over. Those are very prone to raising themselves. And it's also just a pretty cool time to see how this wood is going to look, and this is a really pretty piece of wood. Alright, we've sanded through 120 grit, water popped it, and the water has now dried. And you can't really see it, but what you'll be able to feel is a pretty rough surface, and it's going to be really easy to track our sanding progress on the next grit, because where you sand will be nice and smooth because that kind of hairs have been raised on this wood, and it's going to be really easy to knock those down. But before we do that, what I always like to do first is I like to sand the edges, because I don't care who you are, you're not going to give as good of a sanding pattern as one of our orbital sanders. So what I like to do is I'm going to come through, I'm going to sand our edges, and I always lead this by a grit. I don't know why. I feel like if I'm sanding by hand, I'm going to do it at a little higher grit. So our next grit for the table is going to be 150, so I'm going to use 180 grit to sand these edges over. And this is because any of those kind of sanding scratches that I'm going to induce from my big ugly mitts are going to be removed on the surface of this table when I come through with my orbital sander. So always do my edges before doing the top. However, before I do any sanding, I'm going to get my air compressor over here. I'm going to blow off the surface of this, and this is going to remove the grit from the previous surface, which can compromise your finish, and it's also going to expose any tiny little pits or cracks that I might need to still fill, because you are totally fine filling those little pits and cracks with these lower grits. However, when you get up to that last sanding grit that we're going to use, you really don't want to use that sandpaper to remove the CA glue touch-ups that we're going to do. Alright, I didn't quite get finished sanding today. I was hoping to get a coat of finish on this, but it doesn't look like I'm going to get there. That's okay though, because it gives me a chance to show you a really cool tip that can save your project. This is sitting on a piece of foam underneath. It's just some foam insulation to keep any dents or dings from hurting it as we move it around. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some painter's plastic over the top, because what can happen is this top being exposed to the air and the top isn't really exposed to air, especially I have a fireplace going, I have a heater up there, and I can come back tomorrow, or I could potentially come back tomorrow, and this table could be warped slightly from that moisture escaping one side and not the other, or moisture being added to one side and not the other. So this is some of that static cling plastic, and I use this sheet over and over again. It doesn't have to be a brand new sheet. And I'm just going to spread it out Then I'll generally throw a blanket on top of this just to add a little weight and make sure that plastic stays in contact to it. And this is going to do a remarkably good job at equalizing that moisture content in the wood between your finishing steps. All right, we'll see you tomorrow. All right, it is the next morning now, and to catch you up to speed, this piece came off the wide belt sander at 100 grit. I then sanded it with 120 grit, 150 grit, and 180 grit. And this used to be where I would stop. This is essentially as high as you can sand a piece of wood and still get that protection from the Rubio Monocoat. However, this piece is a little different. We're going to be providing that nano coating, the Blacktail Studio N3, and that's going to enable us to sand a little bit higher. We're going to go up to 240. I have tested it up to around 400 grit and still gets incredible protection, but we're going to go one more grit. We're going to go from this 180 up to 240 grit, and that is going to be where we're going to end it at. Rubio Monocoat does give some conflicting instructions when you try to read up on how to apply their finish. I've read some places that say not to sand higher than 120 grit, some places that say not to sand higher than 150, and then I'll read other places where they say don't sand higher than 180. We are going to go higher than all of those, and you should know that Rubio Monocoat was designed as a floor finish, and it's really an entirely different process using it on a floor versus furniture. I do know that Rubio Monocoat does send people to my last video on how to apply their finish, so they must like some of what I'm doing. There has been a lot of experimentation that I've done to kind of come up with this method, and it's not to say that nobody's ever done it exactly how I've done it, but I did work with Rubio. I talked to them about how to best apply this, specifically on walnut. But when you get on, try to read their literature, it is a little bit conflicting, so don't let that scare you off from anything that I'm going to show you. It's probably worth mentioning that this is the Blacktail Studio finishing tutorial. It's not my old shop teacher's finishing tutorial. It's not the Rubio Monocoat finishing tutorial. It's not the other guy on YouTube finishing tutorial. This is how I do it and how I've had a lot of success. Like I mentioned, I sanded this piece up to 180 grit, and the last thing I'm going to do is sand this up to 240 grit, making sure to first sand my edges and then the tops. Something I didn't mention before is I don't do a pencil grid before this last grid, and sometimes even 2 grids before that. I know that the idea is you're going to remove all the pencil marks and it should never be an issue, but I'm always a little paranoid if I do that pencil grid on the very last grid, I'm going to miss a spot. And I shouldn't miss it. I should check it with the lights and do everything within my power to make sure I don't, but I skip it. And if you do a water pop like I did before this last grid, you'll be able to feel the difference in texture. It'll be a little bit rougher, then when you sand it'll be very, very smooth. So I avoid doing that pencil grid before the very last sanding grid. And on all grids, but especially this last final sanding pass, use those lights like we talked about. Get down low, inspect it, look for scratches. Sometimes you almost subconsciously don't want to see them because you spent so much time and you don't want to have to go back down grids, but really trust those lights, use them. You'll be so thankful that you spot them now in the sanding process before you get into the finishing. All right, I have now finished sanding this to 240 grit, and the last thing I'm going to do is just blow it off with compressed air. Rubio Monocoat does specifically recommend cleaning every piece with their raw wood cleaner. I tend to suspect that this is just a marketing grab for them to sell this really, really overpriced mineral spirits, or at least something that smells a lot like mineral spirits. If you want, you can use it. You're not going to hurt anything. It takes a really long time to dry. It's really expensive. With walnut, domestic woods, I haven't had any issues not using that raw wood cleaner. If you're using a really oily tropical wood, that may be a time you want to consider using something like that. But for me, I'm just going to hit it with the compressed air and then it'll be ready for finish. No matter what type of piece you're finishing and what finish you're using, I strongly recommend finishing both sides in the same session. I have had instances in the past where I would finish only one side, and I was going to wait till that side was dry, flip it over the next morning, and then finish the other side. And I've come back the next morning, and there's a significant cup in that table from the other side, either absorbing moisture from the air or losing moisture to the air. So what we're going to do, I'm going to flip this onto the back side. We'll finish that and wipe all the finish off best we can, but it still will be technically wet. Then we're going to flip it over and finish the top. And that might sound a little weird to some of you, but I promise it's going to work out in the end, and I'll show you how. If I haven't mentioned it yet, I have a very thick moving blanket here, and I also have a piece of styrofoam underneath, and that is to prevent any potential issues when I'm doing stuff like this. Another hard lesson I've learned is jockeying these things around while I'm finishing, flipping it over and finding a big dent or streak in it from something hard on the surface underneath. So keep something nice and soft underneath. The finish we're going to be using is Rubio Monocoat, and like I've mentioned before, this is not sponsored in any way. Rubio has never given me any money or even sent me a can of finish. It's just the best finish I've found for these types of tables. It's what's called a hard wax oil. It's a blend of waxes and oils, and unlike a film finish like a polyurethane or a varnish like you might be used to, this doesn't get us protection by giving a clear plastic layer between the wood and your object. This actually soaks into the wood, kind of like a linseed oil, and that's how it gets the protection. And it's much better than the linseed oils and the tung oils. And also, it doesn't really yellow. There's other brands of hard wax oils out there. I've tried almost all of them, if not all of them, and this one outperforms pretty much everything I've tested it against. Osmo can look really nice. It can actually get to a higher sheen than the Rubio, but it just doesn't get the protection that the Rubio does. There's other ones like Palm Magic Oil. Stay away from Odie's oil. That finish, it looks great after the first few hours or even a couple days, and then for me, it always just dries up and looks horrible. I've had to redo all of the customer tables I ever finished with Odie's. Just looked atrocious weeks or months later, and I ended up redoing everything with Rubio. So stick with Rubio if you want my opinion. And a good rule for hard wax oils is the higher you sand, the higher the sheen is, unlike a lacquer that's going to be the same sheen no matter what it is, because it's what it is designed for. It's that it gets its sheen from the kind of clear coat or the flattening agents itself. These get their sheen from how high you sand it. So if you sand this to 120 grit, it'll be very matte. 150, still pretty matte. We went up to 240, and this is going to be a really nice satin finish, which is about as high as you can get this Rubio Monocoat finish. So you can't get a high gloss, which is a bummer. I would love it if you could, but we're going to get to a really nice, even satin finish with this Rubio at 240 grit. There are some drawbacks to Rubio. It is a two-part finish, so you need to mix part A and part B at like a 3-to-1 ratio, and this gives it a lot more protection and also speeds up the curing process, where something like that Osmo might take 3 weeks to cure. This cures in 7 days if you use this accelerant, and Rubio actually claims it provides more protection as well as increasing or in speeding up that curing time. So the bummer with that is you got to mix just the right amount, and you always end up throwing away some or having to mix up more mid-batch. So I don't like that. It's also pretty expensive, especially when you look at something like a box store polyurethane that might be 20 bucks for something this size. This costs about 150. However, this will get you probably, 10 times the amount of tables that one of those cans of polyurethane will get you. This goes a lot further. So it's not apples to apples. So don't look at this as $150 for a small jug of it, and the Home Depot one is 20 bucks, because those ones aren't going to go nearly as far. So it's an expensive upfront purchase, but it goes a lot further. For the mixing process, I use just a regular old red Solo cup. I keep these teaspoons on hand, and they're pretty well worn, but it doesn't really affect anything. This isn't where it has to be right down in the milliliter or everything's going to explode on you in a horrible chemical reaction. As long as you get pretty close between A and B, you'll be fine. And then just a plastic spoon, plastic fork, plastic knife. Another bummer of Rubio Monocoat is there's almost always a little film that settles after you open this can. It starts getting exposed to the air, and you end up throwing away some of this. It's like a little pudding layer, a little pudding skin that films up on top of this. So just another downside to using the Rubio. You also want to stir it really well. Those oils and waxes start to separate as they sit there. And now we need to start thinking about how much we're going to use, because like I said, you want to mix up just the right amount, but not too much. This is a big piece, and I have never got around to doing the math on how many square feet is how many milliliters. Someone smarter than me out there probably has done that math. So I usually just kind of wing it. But again, you're wasting finish that isn't particularly cheap. All right, I got it nice and mixed up. I got my 20 milliliter, and I like to use, I can't remember, I can't even read it now, but I can read that it says 20 milliliters. So I'm going to remember that because I need to mix 3 parts of this to 1 part of this. So for every, let's say 3 scoops, I need 1 scoop of that. 2, 3. I'm just going to go ahead and do 6 scoops, so 6 times 20, 120 milliliters, 4, 5, 6. So again, 6 scoops, so I need 2 of the accelerator. And then mix it pretty well. It's not like an epoxy that is hypersensitive, but give it a good mixing. You'll notice that it does smell really nice. I don't find it particularly toxic, but it's always probably in your best interest to look at the SDS sheets and decide your levels of concerns for any SDS or chemicals or VOCs. And this batch, I believe they say don't mix up more than you can use in 15 minutes. So something to consider, especially if you're doing a huge surface. All right, now I'm going to get our spreading utensils. To physically spread this Rubio Monaco on our table, you can do it a number of ways. If you follow me on social media, you've probably seen me use this big Gem Industries buffer. It is great. I love this machine, but it costs like over $500, and this is not really necessary for applying this. Unlike that sander that I showed you earlier that I did think is pretty necessary for getting a great finish, this is just a luxury to have. What I did for a long time before this is I took my old sander here and I would cut off a piece of this white pad that we use to apply it. This is just a white floor pad. You can get these online, or at places like Home Depot even sells them in their rental department because they go with the floor buffing machines. And I would just take it, cut out a shape that fits this, and you don't need to do anything other than add some pressure to it and use this to apply the pressure yourself. Also, we can use a Bondo spreader. This is just a simple one from your local auto parts store. It's a nice flexible one. It works like a credit card, which I've also used credit cards. And you can use this Bondo spreader to spread it around, and then use something like this sander with the white pad to really work it in and build up a little bit of friction. For the C-channels, just a little disposable brush here. You can use any brush. This Rubio isn't particularly easy to clean, so that's why I like the disposable ones. But we're just going to use that to brush down in there. And then after we let as much Rubio soak into this wood as possible over about 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to wipe off all of it, flip it over, do the other side. Most of these floor pads have the center that comes out, and this makes a really nice little hand pad that you can use for the edges. So I'll set this aside, and I'm going to do my best to cut this rough shape here. I know Home Depot sells big square ones, which are a little better for cutting to fit these shapes. But we'll see how this works. But first, I'm going to get these grooves in the C-channels. Since we're not really going to be able to get down into these grooves to wipe off the excess, you want to be pretty sparing with how much you use in there, meaning don't use very much. If you're starting to wonder, what about dust? You just blew off this table, all that dust is up in the air, you have little hairs from this brush falling into your finish. It's not that type of finish. This isn't like those lacquers or polyurethanes. Like I said before, this is similar to those linseed oil finishes or the tung oil, where we're going to saturate the surface and then just wipe off all the excess. Any dust or anything that settles on it isn't going to compromise the finish at all. Now that I got those C-channels filled in, I use my Bondo spreader first A little bit on there. You can see this actually works pretty well. You need to put a good bit of pressure into it, but that's a good thing. For any type of wax finish, a little bit of heat, a little bit of pressure is always a good thing. So kind of lean into it. I would prefer it actually fit this sander, but even with as poor a fit as this is, it's actually working pretty well. I don't like a lot of splatter, so I'm not going to put it on the edge because I don't want it flinging off into my tools. So get it on there, and then let the pad work it in. All right, I've got the entire surface pretty well covered but not saturated. So what I'm looking for now is I come and I look into the light and I'm looking for some of those dry spots to show up. And they're pretty obvious once you get looking into the light. So as you're spotting these dry spots over the next few minutes, we're going to add a little bit more of our finish and we're going to try to get those saturated. However, we are going to do 2 coats with this Rubio Monocoat. And I know Rubio Monocoat means 1 coat, and they say it won't even accept a second coat. However, they're wrong. So we are going to do our best job to get it saturated as we can, but in the end, it's not a huge deal if we don't get it all the way saturated because we're going to come back and add a second coat. All right, I'm going to let this set for a few more minutes, and I know I mentioned earlier that you're supposed to mix up only as much Rubio as you can use in 15 minutes. I'm probably going to go a little bit beyond that, which I've done quite a few times, and I haven't found it to be, like epoxy sensitive where it's going to cure into a solid brick, but I'd like to get it all used maybe within 30 minutes or so. All right, we'll be back in a couple minutes. All right, it's been about 10 minutes and it's looking pretty well saturated. So the next thing we need to do is we need to wipe all of it off. I mean everything. This isn't one of those film finishes. This is not polyurethane. This isn't lacquer. So if you don't take anything else from this workshop, take that as you need to wipe off all of this. You do not get more protection by leaving a little bit on or leaving more on, which is not the case for all hard wax finishes. Something like an Osmo, you're actually supposed to leave a little bit on. I'm going to use these blue shop rags. I flip them in half, so that way I have kind of clean quarters that I can rotate and flip it to the other side and just extend the use of these rags. But I'm going to wipe it off best I can. When you're disposing of any oily rags, I've talked to people that have actually burned their shops down, and you can burn your home down, so you need to dispose of these properly. I have a little fire trash can. It's that steel trash can with a lid on it. So I'm going to make sure all my oily rags get disposed of properly. Don't just pile them up on top of a bunch of flammable liquids or something like that. Again, just like when we're sanding, we're using the light, see if we have any shiny spots with too much of the finish on there. And you cannot wipe off too much, but you can leave too much on. So that means wipe off as much as possible. So even though we've wiped off all of the excess oil, it is still wet. So when we flip it, that surface that's going to be in contact with this moving blanket is still going to need to be dry, it's still going to be wet. So we're going to elevate it with some of these little pucks, but again, they're still going to be touching this wet surface, which will leave a mark, but we'll fix that mark on our next coat. All right, ready to flip it. All right, right, so now that I got it flipped over, I'm gonna take another one of these little blue rags, and I'm gonna put one under each one of these pucks. All right, now we're ready to do the exact same finishing process on the top side. Same as before, just troweling on our Rubio. For this top side, I wanted to show you just how nice this power buffer is. Again, it's a big investment, but I showed you that you can use that orbital sander, but if you want to splurge, if you want the investment, if you do a lot of these tables, I do think this is a worthwhile investment. I'm not entirely done buffing on the top, but while that's starting to soak in, I'm going to hit the sides with that little pad that we have here. The nice thing is, since we elevated it, I can get all the way down to the bottom of these sides without missing anything. Right now I don't have much light back here because it's better for the video shoot, but I'm going to take a light here in a little bit and make sure we don't have any dry spots or miss anything. All right, I can see this piece is getting very dry already, so I'm going to add a good amount more of finish and buff it in. Table is looking really nice. There's nothing that has jumped out at me saying that I made a mistake. I'm gonna let it absorb for a little while longer. I'm gonna get a light, come around, check these edges, make sure I didn't miss any spots, and see how we're looking. All right, this is a light stick. It's a little photography light, and I'm gonna use this to just make sure I don't have any dry spots or completely blank spots that I missed with the finish. Here's a good example there. The spot that I missed. Here's another spot that I missed. These light sticks make good sanding inspection tools as well. So when you're going through your sanding process, you can use this to get really close and check the quality of your sanding. All right, I'm gonna let this set for just a couple more minutes, wipe off the excess, and we will be done for today. All right, it's been about 10 minutes or so, and I don't think there's gonna be any more finish absorbed into this wood. So just like the other side, I'm gonna get a couple of these blue shop rags, and I'm gonna wipe off every bit of excess, and it's gonna start to look pretty good now. But it's not gonna look as good as it will after the next coat and then the nano finish coat. So don't get discouraged if it's not right where you want it after this first coat, because the Rubio finish tends to look really, really dry after only one coat, which is why I can't believe they call it a one coat finish, because it does not look like a good furniture piece after just one coat. So it'll look good, it'll look okay, but it's gonna be really matte, pretty dry looking. And it's gonna stay like that until we add that next coat and then consecutive nano finish coats. All of that said is if you get done with this first coat and it's absolutely perfect, you love the matte sheen of it, you think it's exactly what you were hoping for, you don't need to go any further. I would still recommend doing the nano finish coats for protection, but you do not have to add this second coat. It's going to be largely just for aesthetics. This is another really good time to break out your light stick. Just look for any shiny spots. Because again, you can't wipe off too much, but you can leave on too much. So we want to wipe off everything that we can with these blue rags before it cures. Right now, I think I got it about as good as I can. However, sometimes I'll come back in maybe 20, 30 minutes and see if any of that oil has kind of oozed back up out of the surface and wipe that off. You'll also notice, at least I almost always notice, a few especially dry spots. And again, this is going to get fixed on that next coat. And another reason why I don't think that it's really a one coat finish. But all in all, this is exactly how I was hoping it would look at this point. All right, we're going to leave this for at least 24 hours. If it's a little bit cooler, which my shop is, probably 48 hours before moving on to that next coat. See you then. Where we last left off, I said we needed to wait at least 24 to 48 hours before starting the process for the second coat on this table. However, I hadn't started building the legs for this particular coffee table yet, so for me, it has been about 2 or 3 weeks since we last did that coat of Rubio Monaco, which is just fine. I get that question a lot is, what if I wait longer than 48 hours? Can I still apply this process? And the answer is absolutely. It just needs to be at least 24 to 48 hours. So right now, I think it's been right about 3 weeks since I last applied a coat of Rubio, and now we'll start the process for the second coat. Rubio Monaco advertises that it is a one coat finish. It says that its finish is so durable and so repellent that another coat of Rubio won't even stick to that first coat, which isn't exactly true. I've found that a second coat can be applied. However, if you don't do any preparation before that second coat, it leaves the kind of shiny spots and halos, and it just doesn't look very good overall. So I worked with Rubio and I talked to him and I said, hey, it's too dull, it's too inconsistent with one coat on walnut. What can we do to apply that second coat? And what we eventually landed on is this, and that is using a maroon abrasive pad. These are called non-woven pads. You probably call them Scotch-Brite pads. They're similar to what you would use on your dishes. This is a gray pad. This is a maroon pad. There's white pads, different colors. All of the colors relate to their abrasiveness. So for this process, you need a maroon pad, and I've tried the gray pad. This is a finer one. You don't get a better, finer, shinier finish using the gray pad. You get some more of that haloing process. So you must have a maroon pad. These are available on Amazon. They're available at woodworking stores. It is pretty abrasive. They say this is equivalent to around a 320 grit or so. How we're going to use this maroon pad is we're going to put it right onto our sander, and you do not need to overthink this. People always think they need to apply adhesive or sticky tape or something like that. All we're going to do is take our regular sander, has a hook loop pad on it. I'm going to set it just like that. Take a pair of scissors that you don't care about very much. And I'm just going to cut a square. That's all you got to do. It'll stick on there just fine. How I like to use this maroon pad is I keep the pressure very light. All we're trying to do is basically leave a frosted surface that looks as consistent as we can across the entire table. I usually don't use the vacuum. I find that tends to clog up these pads, and I'll use some compressed air to occasionally blow it out. And I'm just going to work randomly across the table, trying to make it that nice, smooth, even frosted look. And right now, I'm seeing exactly what I wanted to see. It just leaves a nice kind of frosted look. If it's looking like it's gummy or tacky, you were probably doing this a little too soon. I knew this wouldn't be a problem because this was finished 3 weeks ago, but if you're pushing that 24 to 48 hour timeline, you can notice this kind of gum up, and then you'll want to let it wait a little while longer, maybe another day or two. Also, you might be wondering why I waited this long to add the second coat, and that's because when I'm mounting the table base, you're always sliding it around, you're kind of shimming it around, and you're going to put these little scuffs in there. And I didn't want the totally finished perfect table to get those scuffs. So this maroon pad is going to even out any of those little sliding marks that your table base might have made, or just moving the table around in the shop during those couple weeks while the table was getting finished. I wanted to wait till I'm essentially ready to deliver this piece before doing this final coat process. Can also be helpful to keep a microfiber around and wipe away some of that dust so you'll be able to see how consistent your sanding pattern is. So far it's looking pretty good. Also, this is one of the only times I turn the speed down on my sander. I have it about half speed. I've done it at full speed, I've done it at completely low speed. They both work okay, but I like kind of that middle ground, kind of medium. I think I'm on about a 2.5 speed here. Right now the pad isn't looking too clogged, but I'll show you what it looks like when we clean it out. When we do the same process on the top, we'll show you some additional angles of what we're really looking for in this maroon pad to show you how we want just a nice, consistent, even sheen across the entire piece. Right now, I think this looks pretty good, and we are specifically only going to be finishing the underside here. I'm not going to get any of the sides. We're going to do the sides and the top together. All right, let's get our Rubio together. All right, for applying the Rubio to the underside, I didn't really want to use a whole big buffing pad because they're kind of expensive. It cost me, I don't know, like $1.50 just to do this one side. And it doesn't take a ton of finish on the second coat. That first coat really absorbs a lot. The second coat does not take very much. So I keep one of these sacrificial pads around for my hand application. And I'm going to apply the entire coat with just this little piece of a pad. And also you might notice, didn't have these before, these are the recesses for my table base, and there's no finish in there now, so I'll apply some finish on this coat. I will say, doing a big piece like this with a little hand scrap does get your hand a little tired. All right, just like before, I'm looking for any dry spots. You won't see as many because it is really well sealed with that one coat of Rubio, but you want to make sure you don't miss any of the spots that you sanded. Those will really, really stick out if you miss one of those. And I generally like to wait about 10 or 15 minutes, just like the other coat, before wiping this one off. So I'm going to keep kind of playing around with it, touching up any dry spots, and then we'll come wipe it off in about 10 or 15 minutes. Also, I got a question, am I going to apply a second coat to the C-channels? And no, I'm not. Rubio does do a great job of sealing the wood with one coat, but it doesn't quite look as good. However, those are going to be covered with the metal C-channels, so they're going to be just fine with that one coat. All right, I'm going to keep my eye on it, maybe touch up a few dry spots, but other than that, we'll be back in about 10 or 15 minutes to wipe this off. All right, it's been about 15 minutes. I believe it's absorbed about as much as it can, so just like before, we're going to wipe it off with our blue shop towels. And remember, we want all of it off. Don't leave any on. So right now I've wiped off the entire table, but I didn't do that good of a job. I wanted to show you something that got me early on when I was doing this. Even though you wipe it very thoroughly, this rag gets a little damp and your handprint will leave little shiny spots, and those will stay if you don't wipe them up with a clean rag. So as I'm looking, I see some there, I see some over here, but you might not see them from the other direction, which is why I'm working into a really bright light. So I'm going to get a brand new clean rag and make sure we don't have any of those little kind of fingerprint spots that soaked through the rag. So I'm just going to go through, look for any of those shiny spots that my fingers left, and wipe off all the excess. If you missed one of these spots and you need to come back and fix it, the only real way is to do this maroon pad process and do it all over again, which I've done before. I've got completely done with a table, or it was actually a kitchen island, and the sheen just wasn't that even. So I went back to the maroon pad, sanded the whole thing over again, added another coat, and it looked great. So you're not limited to just 2 coats if you don't like the way it looks. You can do another pass with that maroon pad, try it again. One thing I didn't touch on is those puck marks. Since we finished this underside, then we flip it essentially immediately and then set some towels with some either 2x4s or elevated pucks, you get these little marks on your table, and this is where you can remove those. So if you have some little marks left, you sand those out with that maroon pad, add this second coat, and the bottom side will look just as nice as the top. You can see there's not a lot to applying this second coat of Rubio. The whole process only takes about 15 to 20 minutes. Right now, I'm going to wait at least 24 hours before flipping this table over and then doing the same process on the top. So that's where we'll leave it, and we will see you tomorrow. All right, it has been almost exactly 24 hours since we applied the last coat of Rubio on the underside, and everything looks really, really nice. As a general rule, I like to wear gloves for the first couple days after applying any finish. So right now, I'm going to flip this over and do the same process on the top. For finishing the top, I like to get it elevated so I have easy access to the sides and I'm not putting any finish on this blanket here. So this is just a puck. You could use a 2x4, a little chunk, whatever you want, and I'm going to put it under the blanket. If you don't have a blanket, just putting a blue shop rag or paper towel over this is just fine. This is my maroon pad from yesterday. You can see it's slightly used. It's actually not too bad yet. I would probably keep using this side if I was still sanding on the underside. However, I'd like to start fresh and make sure it's as consistent as possible. So, just gonna flip it around. Fresh side. I can't emphasize how much you want a nice, consistent pattern. So when you look down, it'll look a little frosted, it'll look dull because we are dulling it, but you want it to be as consistent as you can across the entire piece. You don't want any slightly shinier areas. You want just a nice frosted look across the entire surface. And I'll see if I can demonstrate a good job and a marginal job as we go through this. So what I did just now is I intentionally did kind of a quick job so I could give you an example of what you're looking for. Is I'm looking over here and I see a nice consistent frosted pattern. And then here it's a little bit lighter, it's a little bit shinier, and this is what you want to avoid. You want to come back, sand that out, make it look as even as the rest of the tabletop. That looks a lot better, and it's worth mentioning if you're doing a solid wood table, this is much easier than doing an epoxy table. If you're doing a black epoxy table like I frequently do, getting that even sheen across the black resin is incredibly difficult. So just know it's going to take you a little more time, a little more finessing if you are trying to even out the sheen on the epoxy portion. It's getting a little bit clogged, or not so clogged, but you can just see a bunch of that debris in there, so I'm going to clean it out. I'd say good as new, but this actually does wear down. So if you're doing a very large surface, you'll need to go through a couple of these pads or flip it over. And I think this pad will be just enough to get this entire top. However, know that it does wear down, so it means that it's going to be less abrasive from the time you start to the time you end. So be conscious of that and maybe switch your pad every, I don't even want to give you a square footage, but just be aware it does wear down. All right, I just finished the first once over. I'm gonna give it a good wipe with the microfiber and see how it looks. Again, looking back into the light, I can see right here, it is faintly shinier. It's got a little more sheen. So I want to address that area. Look into this light over here. I can see some areas over there. I rarely get it perfect on the first try, but once you do get it perfect, you want to stop because you don't want to abrade any more than you have to. So a few more passes. You have to remember some of the grain orientation is just going to look a little different than other grain. But yeah, the sheen looks consistent. Yeah, I'd say overall looks pretty good. I'll keep checking it as I go through the abrading of the sides, but right now I think we're pretty close. All right, now I need to do the same thing to the sides. Just be conscious of these corners. Just like anytime you're sanding finish on a corner, it's going to be easier to burn through that finish and remove it altogether. So I'm just going to very lightly touch the corners and then get the sides nice and even. And to make it a little easier, pull it over the edge. I'm actually just going to do it by hand. Barely any weight. And that way I won't burn into the wood. All right, I'll give it hopefully one final wipe down. I'll give it a good inspection with a light, and hopefully we'll be ready for the next coat of Rubio. All right, I'm going to give it a quick shot of compressed air to blow off any of that last little bit of dust. Don't go crazy here. If you have a little bit in those wood pores, it's going to be just fine, but I'm going to blow it off the best I can. All right, just like before, I have the Rubio Monocoat Pure mixed up at a ratio of 3:1 with their accelerator. And since I've been showing different methods of applying the Rubio, for the top, I'm going to go back to the buffer. And if you have a choice, I always recommend a buffer or a sander when applying Rubio. From what I understand, heat is good for any type of wax finish. So getting a little bit of friction in there is going to get you a better bond, better protection. That's complete hearsay as far as I'm concerned. I've never tested that. I haven't had that proven, but that's what the old guys say. So I'm going to use my buffer for this. And also be aware when you're using a big buffing pad, you're going to lose a lot of finish because it's going to get soaked up into that pad. So it does cost you a little bit more, but that's the method we're going to go for with the top here. Quick note on using a buffer, if you're doing an epoxy table, be a little careful leaving it in one place too long, because what this buffer can do is it can actually start to polish the edge of the epoxy, so it'll change that epoxy sheen slightly to the wood. So with these, you want to keep moving pretty frequently. And after I get this first coat on there, I'm going to go in and hit the sides, and then I'm going to come back and buff this some more. And right now, the way we're filming, I have horrible light back here, so I'm probably going to miss some spots, but I'll definitely check that before we're done. Meaning, if you have the choice, put a light back here so you can see what you're applying. All right, I'm gonna put the buffer back on, work it in for a few more minutes, and then it should be ready to wipe off. All right, it's been about 5 minutes. Now I'm ready to wipe off all of the excess oil. I go a little sloppy on this first pass just to get the majority of the oil off. And then I come back with clean rags and make sure to get every last bit of it off. This part is where it starts to get fun because the table is starting to look how it's going to look when it's completely finished. And this looks really, really good. All right, I think right now it looks really good. Once you're sure you have every last bit wiped off, you might notice the sheen isn't completely even. Don't panic just yet, let it set overnight, and as that finish starts to cure, it should even out. So if it doesn't look right the next morning, you can address it, but don't freak out if it doesn't look absolutely perfect right now. But for me, I think we look really nice, and I'm gonna leave this alone for at least about 48 hours. It's been about 3 days since I last applied that second coat of Rubio Monaco, and for me, everything looks pretty good. Not quite exceptional yet, and we'll go into how we get to that next level in just a minute. But first I want to talk about what if things don't look good? What if you aren't happy with the way that second coat went on? What most likely happened is you didn't get an even sanding pattern with that maroon pad where you could probably see some of the lines in your sanding tracks. And that's okay. If you need to go back and do another pass with that maroon pad, you can apply another coat of Rubio just like that second coat, and it should go on and even everything out really, really nicely. It's something I've done in the past. Don't be too discouraged. Just go through all the same steps that we did for that second coat, apply another coat of Rubio, and let that cure for a couple of days. For me, the sanding pattern looks really good. It looks nice, even, and consistent. However, on these kind of crazy grain slabs like this one, I can see a few dry spots where that Rubio didn't quite absorb all the way in, and I think we can get it a little bit better. And the way we're going to do that is using this Rubio Monaco maintenance oil. As far as I understand it, it's basically like a thinned out version of their regular Rubio Monaco. And for this though, there's no prep, there's no sanding, there's no anything. We're just going to pour it on. I'm going to buff the edges with just a cutoff piece. I'm going to buff the top with my buffer, but you can apply this any way that you would normally apply the Rubio Monaco. You should note that Rubio says you need to wait at least 72 hours before applying this maintenance oil over the Rubio Monaco. You don't need to overthink this. You just give it a good shake. Apply, I don't know, somewhat liberal amount. And just work it in just like before. After I got the top entirely covered, I'm going to let that continue to soak in, and I'm going to get the edges. Also worth noting, I don't do this on the underside. I don't find it incredibly necessary. If you wanted to go to that next step, you are welcome to. You're not going to hurt anything, but I generally don't put the maintenance oil on the underside. Since it does slightly change the sheen, you need to make sure you don't miss any spots. That's where, just like applying the finish, a good light is helpful. Here's a good reason why having a light is very important. I got down here, I thought this side was completely covered, and I see big streaks that I missed. So make sure you have a good light. All right, we got it pretty well saturated. I'm going to let it sit for about 10 minutes or so before coming back and wiping off all the excess just like before. All right, it's been about 10 minutes since we applied that maintenance oil. Now, just like before, we're going to wipe every last bit of it off. Just like before, make sure we get every bit of it off. I should say every bit of the excess off. Everything is looking absolutely fantastic. The only thing left to do is to really apply the protection to this. And the Rubio protects okay by itself, maybe a cup on there for 5 or 10 minutes, but the nano coating that we're going to apply next is where it really just blows it out of the water. You're going to up the contrast, you're going to up the sheen, and you're going to up the protection by magnitude. So the only downside is you need this finish to cure completely. So we're going to let this finish cure for about 7 days before moving on to that next step.